Good afternoon. We're continuing the laws of the 3 weeks and the 9 days, and we are in the middle of the Mishnah Berurah, Tafkuf Nun Aleph, 551, Sif Beis, number 2. So we learned that there is a prohibition to build during the 9 days. The 9 days will be starting the Shabbos. Shabbos is Rosh Chodesh Av, the first of the month of Av. So until then, from Rosh Chodesh Av until Tisha B'Av, the laws of mourning get more strict than they are now. Right now we're in the 3 weeks. So what's prohibited is really only listening to music, making weddings, shaving, making a shechiyanu, or cutting your hair. Or during the 9 days, we're going to learn, we'll get more into the details of what's prohibited during the 9 days, but there are more things which are prohibited so that we really feel the mourning of the destruction of the 2 temples. So the first thing we learned about the 9 days last time was that one should decrease his business dealings. And then what the Mishnah Berurah said on that really nowadays we're not so noeg like that. That's not really the practice because we need to make a livelihood and we don't really have to decrease so much. The custom is not to so much. Okay, so let's continue. Also, we shouldn't make buildings of happiness, buildings of joy. Could go in beis chasnas l'bano, like someone wants to build. Actually, I just heard on the radio that a famous rock group, they got married, not a rock group, country, Blake Shelton, married his sweetheart in Oklahoma, and they built a special chapel to get married in on his property. So that's what the Shulchan Aruch is talking here. It says, Go and beis chasnas l'bano. A person during the 9 days cannot build a wedding hall for his son. So if anyone's planning to do that during the 9 days, don't. Or binyan shel tzir v'kiyur, or a building of drawings and paneling, a fancy building, u'm'netiyah shel simcha, or plantings of happiness, like just to plant a nice garden. Konavar nikisha malachim shenaitim letzel lehistofif betzilo, a certain type of garden that kings would plant trees for shade. Omine hadas umine olim, or different types of hadas or canopies. So you shouldn't build any of these things. V'im hayakos lenota lipol, if your wall is going to fall. Afal pi shehu shel simcha moto livnos, if it is for even if it's in a building of simcha, so you're in the middle of building your wedding hall for your child, and you stop during the 9 days because you're not supposed to be building it, but one of the walls starts to fall, so then you're allowed to fix it during the 9 days. And the Ramah adds, mitzvah hakol sharin, for a mitzvah it's all allowed. Now let's see the Mishnah Berurah here. He says all construction, if it's not for the purpose of living, so if you're building a house to live in during the 9 days, that you can build. But any other type of construction, even if it's not a wedding hall for your son, the Mishnah Berurah says you also shouldn't do. So you just want to build a gazebo in the backyard, during the 9 days, you should not be doing that. Now let's say you paid someone who isn't Jewish to build you something during the 9 days. You paid him before the 9 days, so then it's allowed. He can even build it on Tisha B'Av. Because he's working for himself. He's working to get paid. Same thing if you paid someone before to paint your house. You paid someone who isn't Jewish before the 9 days to paint your house, you can do it. Nevertheless, Tisha B'Av Tavolov Bracha. But he says it's a good thing if you can pay this non-Jewish person a little bit of money so that he'll do the construction after the 9 days, then it's a good thing to do. However, to build a synagogue or something related to the synagogue, that someone's allowed to do during the 9 days because it's a mitzvah for the multitudes. And then we are lenient. Okay, note the lipol, but we said that when it comes to building, if there's a wall which is going to fall down, then you could build it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, כגון שעומד הכוסף בחצר ואפשר לסגור החצר ולהיכנס אדם לשם, אלא שיש לחש להפסד ממון, כגון שעל ידי נפילתו יישבר החיימה ויזקקל יייסר, אפילו הכימות לבנות אף שהוא בן ישל שמחה, שהרי אינו יייסר בשביל שמחה, כי אם בשביל הפסד. The Mishnah Berurah says, even if there's no danger that the wall will hurt anybody, let's say you have a wall and it's all gated up, and you have a wall in your yard, and you lock the yard so nobody can get in, or you're like in New York City when they're doing construction, they put these big fences around so no one can get in. So no one's going to get hurt even if it falls. So even if no one's going to get hurt, you're still allowed to fix the wall. If the wall falling over will cause a financial loss, it'll damage something else. So you're allowed to fix it. You don't have to incur a financial loss in this respect in the 9 days. It's only, you're not supposed to build a building that would make you happy. But here you're just preventing a loss. So that you could do. Mitzvah. So for a mitzvah, somebody could build. כגון שאין לו איש ובנים ואין לו בייס חסנס, מותר לבנוס בייס חסנס, דמדינה אפילו נישואין מותר בזה, ומה שאין נוהג גם ליסה איש הכלל, היינו משום דלא מסתמי מילסה, ועל כן מותר לעשות בייס חסנס או לעשות בגדם חדש ולצורך נישואין שהיה אחר תשע באב. אבל מי שכן פרביר ועשו בכל זה, he says, somebody who isn't married and doesn't yet have kids, so it's a mitzvah for him to get married, to have children. So if he doesn't have a wedding hall, so then it's a mitzvah for him to build a wedding hall. That he'd be allowed to do during the 9 days. Because he says, really, technically, even though we don't get married during the 3 weeks, it's technically allowed. It's only a custom during this time because it's not a good omen to get married during this time of year. But if somebody wants to build a wedding hall, like you're Blake Shelton, and you want to build a chapel on your property for your wedding after Tisha B'Av, that you could do if you've never been married and never had kids. Or if you want to make garments for your wedding, that's going to be after Tisha B'Av. That's allowed. Now, what you're not allowed to do, that's only if you've never been married, never had kids, and you already fulfilled the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply. But if this is like your second marriage and you already have 12 kids, then you wouldn't be allowed to even make a chapel on your property. Okay, let's continue in the Shulchan Aruch on top. Ve'ein nosen nashim ve'ein nosen seudas erisin. Now, there's two parts of a Jewish marriage. There's what's called erisin and nesuin. Erisin is when the man gives the woman the ring, and he sanctifies her that she is prohibited to everyone in the world. Right? So she is, and that includes him. After you do the first stage of the wedding called erisin, the man is not allowed to live with his wife yet. Only after the second stage, nesuin, is the man allowed to live with his wife. There's a whole debate what nesuin is, what the chuppah really is. If you're interested in that topic, please contact me. It's a very fascinating topic, but there's two stages, erisin and nesuin. So it used to be, back in the day, that they did these two stages separately. Now we do it all together. When you go to a wedding, they do erisin and nesuin, it's all together. But back in the day, they would do erisin, and then like a year later, they would do nesuin. So this woman was sanctified to this man, but they didn't live together yet as husband and wife. That only happened a year later. So let's knowing that, let's continue. Ve'ein nosen nashim ve'ein osen seudas erisin. We don't do weddings during this time. And also, we don't do meals for erisin, which is the first stage of the marriage. But to just do erisin and not have a festive meal, that's allowed. So to give the woman the ring and not have a festive meal, that is allowed without the nesuin. Even on Tisha B'Av itself, you could do erisin. Why? Because maybe somebody else will beat you to the punch, and you want to make sure that you marry this girl. She's the love of your life. So you give her a ring to make sure that nobody else gets her. So you're even allowed to do that on Tisha B'Av. Says the Ramah, and the Ramah writes that the custom is not only during the 9 days, but really the whole 3 weeks. We don't have weddings during Tisha B'Av. Now let's see if the Mishnah Berurah is going to define this a little more. Now you can't do the second stage of the wedding, the nesuin, even if you don't have a festive meal. Even that's allowed. The nesuin balvad ika simcha. When you do the second stage of marriage, there is happiness even without a festive meal. So you can't do that during this time. But he says, perhaps to remarry your first wife, right? If you got divorced and you want to remarry her, so it could be that's allowed. Mishnah Berurah is not sure because maybe there's not so much simcha. Now, obviously, that's only means when your first wife didn't marry anybody else in between. Because if your first wife married a person in between, then you're not allowed to marry her again. But it's only when you divorced her and you want to remarry her and she wasn't married to somebody else in between. But to do the first stage of marriage, the erisin below suda like a simcha kokach. So that you're allowed to do. You're allowed to do the first stage of marriage, which because there's not so much happiness by the first stage. And he says, and that's without a meal. You could do erisin without a meal. And he says, all the more so that you could have an engagement where you write an engagement party during the 3 weeks. That's when you write the tanayim, the deals between the groom's family and the bride's family. But he says, however, to have a whole meal at an engagement party, that's inappropriate. And it shouldn't be, and there should be no singing or there should be no dancing and whatnot. Even on Shabbos you can't do a meal for this. However, usually when we say meal, that means to sit down and wash and have bread and make a whole big deal about it. But to just have like certain treats, he says they used to have sweet meats, whatever that is, when they had engagement parties, that you're allowed to do during the engagement party. So at the engagement party during the 3 weeks, you're allowed to have, and you're allowed to have treats and foods, good foods there, but you can't make a whole meal out of it. You can't have dancing from the 17th of Tammuz and on. Afila below Erison, even without Erison. So if you just want to get together with some friends and start dancing, that should not be done during the 3 weeks. After Erison, said about the Erison, the first stage of marriage, that even though really there is somewhat of happiness doing that, and you really shouldn't be able to do it on Tisha B'Av, we allowed it because we didn't, in case you're worried somebody else is going to take this woman as his bride, and you really wanted to marry her. We're stringent not to get married during the 3 weeks. Even someone who did not fulfill the mitzvah of Peru or Vu, of being fruitful and multiply, should not get married during this time. So while we said that somebody who did not fulfill the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiplying, he's allowed to build a building of a wedding hall for himself during the 3 weeks, he's not allowed to actually get married during the 3 weeks, even though he has to fulfill that mitzvah. And he says at the end of the day that during the 3 weeks, we are lenient even to do erison with a meal, which is the first stage of marriage, that we can do with a meal even during the 3 weeks, but the 9 days that you should not do with a meal. And then he says here in the Sha'ar Tzion, it sounds like Su'uda Shidduchim, which sounds like an engagement meal, that you could do during an actual meal, it sounds like you could do during the 3 weeks. But it's really not so relevant because, for what I've seen, most engagement parties, you don't really sit down and wash and have a thing. So, but there's a difference here between having an engagement party with a sit-down wash meal, where you wash and have a whole meal out of it during the 3 weeks, but not during the 9 days. But during the 9 days, you could get engaged and just, have some food out, but not actually sit down and wash. And if you look in the Dirshu, he brings, even though that here the Sha'ar Tzion says that an engagement party, a meal, is really a Sudas mitzvah, he seems to say in other places, the Mishnah Berurah doesn't sound like that, so you can look that up. So just to summarize, during the 9 days, what do we learn? We learned during the 9 days, one should not build, shouldn't build a building, unless it's something that he needs to live in, or it's a synagogue, building a synagogue, or something like that, or if there's a wall that's going to fall down. Also, we learned that people should not get married during this time. However, during this time, one could get engaged, and we learned about the first part of marriage and second part of marriage. I'm not going to review that because it really doesn't happen nowadays. We all do it together, so there's no weddings at all during the 3 weeks. But to get engaged, even to have treats and food at the engagement party is allowed during the 3 weeks. However, there shouldn't be dancing, and there shouldn't be. I know I sound like footloose a little bit, but there shouldn't be dancing at all during the 3 weeks. If anyone has any specific questions related to their specific set of circumstances, please feel free to reach out. And wishing everyone a beautiful end of their holiday weekend.